Everything we thought we knew was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not off by a generation or a century or even a few centuries. Wrong in a way so fundamental, so complete, so thoroughly overturning of the most basic assumptions that the entire discipline of archaeology had been building its understanding of human prehistory on. Wrong in a way that required not just a revision of the timeline but a complete reimagining of what human beings were capable of, what they needed to create, and which came first in the long, slow, complicated story of how our species became what it is today. The assumption that was wrong was one of archaeology's most comfortable and most confident ones. The assumption that civilization produced temples. That you needed settled communities first, villages, then towns, then cities, then the surplus food and the specialized labor and the organized social hierarchy that food surplus makes possible, before you could build anything as complex, as intentional, and as architecturally demanding as a religious monument. Farming first. Then settlement. Then society. Then, finally, the temples and the ceremonies and the spiritual infrastructure that organized societies build when they have solved the basic problem of feeding themselves and have enough left over to invest in the things that go beyond mere survival. It was a logical sequence. It was supported by everything that archaeology had found, in the Middle East and elsewhere, for over a century of systematic excavation. And it was, as a single hilltop in southeastern Turkey was about to demonstrate, wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically, magnificently, wonderfully wrong. The hilltop is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means potbelly hill, a description of the low, rounded mound that rises from the limestone plateau of southeastern Anatolia near the city of Sanliurfa, in a landscape of dry rolling hills and sparse vegetation that gives no outward hint of what has been lying beneath its surface for 12,000 years. The hill is not spectacular. It does not announce itself. Travelers have been passing through this landscape for centuries without any particular awareness that they were walking over something that would one day require every textbook of human prehistory to be rewritten. A Kurdish shepherd noticed the stone slabs in the 1960s. He was walking across the hilltop and saw what looked like the tops of large stones protruding slightly through the thin soil. He reported what he had seen, in the way that people in agricultural regions of the ancient world sometimes report finding stones, and the report made its way eventually to a survey conducted by archaeologists from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago in 1963. The survey noted the site, recorded the presence of flint tools and the tops of the protruding stones, and classified it, in the assumption that the stone slabs were the remnants of medieval grave markers, which are not uncommon in the region, as a medieval cemetery. Not worth excavating. Not interesting enough to pursue further. The survey was wrong. Profoundly, historically, paradigm-shatteringly wrong. The person who understood how wrong it was arrived at Göbekli Tepe in 1994. His name was Klaus Schmidt, and he was a German archaeologist working for the German Archaeological Institute, a man whose specific expertise in the prehistoric cultures of the ancient Near East gave him eyes trained to see what untrained eyes had missed. Schmidt visited Göbekli Tepe as part of a regional survey and looked at the stone slabs protruding through the thin soil of the hilltop with the specific, practiced attention of a prehistorian who had spent years thinking about the lithic technology and the monumental architecture of the pre-agricultural Neolithic. He saw something immediately that the 1963 survey had missed. The stones were not medieval grave markers. The way they were shaped, the deliberate, carefully worked T-shape that was visible even from the small portions protruding through the surface, was not the shape of any medieval monument he had ever encountered. It was the shape of something much, much older. Something that belonged not to the medieval period but to the deep prehistoric past of the region. Something that, if his instinct was right, was going to be extraordinary. He began excavating the following year. And what emerged from the soil of Potbelly Hill over the next 2 decades of excavation was so extraordinary that Klaus Schmidt reportedly said, shortly after the first major structures were revealed, that he had found the world's first cathedral on a hill. He was not wrong. Göbekli Tepe is a temple complex, a series of large circular enclosures, each built around groups of enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, arranged in patterns that speak unmistakably of deliberate, organized, intentional religious architecture. The pillars are massive, the largest standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing more than 10 tons each, carved from the limestone bedrock of the surrounding plateau using flint tools and then transported to the hilltop and erected in their positions with a precision and a care that speaks of sustained, organized, technically sophisticated effort. And the pillars are not plain. They are carved. Covered in bas-relief images of extraordinary variety and richness. Animals of every kind that inhabited the ancient landscape of southeastern Anatolia, rendered with a naturalism and a confidence of hand that takes the breath away. There are foxes. There are scorpions. There are snakes, their sinuous bodies twisting across the surface of the stone with a dynamism that seems to belong to a living thing rather than a carved one. There are vultures, the great birds of the dead, the creatures that the ancient Near East consistently associated with the transition between life and death and the disposal of the human body after life's end. There are wild boar, and lions, and ducks, and spiders, and beetles, and lizards, and a water bird that might be a crane or an ibis or something else. There are human arms carved on the sides of some of the pillars, just the arms, bent at the elbow with hands resting on the pillar's belly, suggesting that the T-shaped pillars themselves might represent stylized human or supernatural figures, beings rather than posts, presences rather than supports. And they are old. Not slightly old. Not old in the way that ancient Rome is old, or even in the way that the Egyptian pyramids are old. Göbekli Tepe is old in a way that requires a moment of cognitive recalibration every time you encounter it, because the number sits outside the range where human intuition operates comfortably. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the oldest levels of the site places the construction of the earliest enclosures at approximately 9,600 BC. That is 11,600 years ago. That is more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge. More than 5,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. More than 7,000 years before the invention of writing. More than 9,000 years before the birth of Christ. Göbekli Tepe is older than anything that any previous archaeology had prepared us to expect human beings to have been capable of building. And crucially, devastatingly, paradigm-destroyingly, it was built by hunter-gatherers. Not farmers. Not settled communities with grain stores and specialized craftspeople and the social hierarchy that agricultural surplus enables. The geological and biological evidence from Göbekli Tepe and its surrounding landscape is unambiguous on this point. There is no evidence of permanent settlement at the site. There is no evidence of domestic animals or cultivated crops at the levels associated with the earliest construction phases. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, nomadic or semi-nomadic people who lived by hunting the wild aurochs and the gazelle and the wild boar that roamed the Fertile Crescent, and by gathering the wild cereals and the legumes and the fruits that the productive landscape of the ancient Near East provided in abundance before anyone had thought of deliberately planting and tending them. Hunter-gatherers built this. The people who did not stay in one place, who did not accumulate surplus food, who did not have the specialized division of labor that sociology and archaeology had always assumed was the prerequisite for monumental architecture, these people built Göbekli Tepe. And in building it, they overturned the entire sequence that archaeology had spent a century constructing. The temple came before the village. The religious monument came before the settled community. The spiritual impulse, the need to create sacred space, to gather in organized ceremony, to build something that would outlast the individual human lives that made it, this need came first. And the question that this overturning generates, the question that Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his career thinking about and that archaeologists and anthropologists and historians and philosophers have been thinking about ever since the implications of the Göbekli Tepe discovery became clear, is the most profound question that the history of human culture can ask. Did farming follow the temple? Did the need to feed the workers who built and maintained Göbekli Tepe, the large gatherings of hunter-gatherers who must have converged on this hilltop repeatedly over centuries to participate in the ceremonies and to continue the construction, create the pressure that eventually led to the domestication of wild cereals and the invention of agriculture? The Fertile Crescent, where the wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew in natural abundance, is exactly the region where Göbekli Tepe sits. The site is within walking distance of the area where the genetic evidence of cereal domestication points to as the origin of cultivated wheat. Did the temple create farming? Did the spiritual need precede and generate the agricultural revolution rather than following from it as the standard model had always assumed? Schmidt believed this was the case. He spent his career arguing that Göbekli Tepe represented evidence for what he called the temple hypothesis, the idea that the gathering of hunter-gatherer communities for religious ceremonies at permanent sacred sites created both the social complexity and the logistical pressure that drove the invention of agriculture. You need to feed a gathering. You need to feed the workers who maintain the sacred space. When you gather the same people in the same place repeatedly across generations, you begin to manage the wild plants around the gathering site, to encourage the plants that produce the most food, to protect them from competing plants and from grazing animals, to harvest them systematically rather than opportunistically. And that management, intensifying over generations, is farming. The temple hypothesis is not universally accepted. Other archaeologists argue that the causal relationship between the religious gathering and the agricultural development is harder to establish than Schmidt's confident formulation suggested, that correlation in time and space is not the same as causation, and that the invention of agriculture may have been driven by multiple factors across multiple regions rather than by a single religious impulse at a single site. The debate continues. It will probably continue for decades, as archaeologists excavate more of the site. Less than 5% of Göbekli Tepe's full extent has been excavated, the remainder preserved beneath the hilltop for future generations with better tools, and as the scientific community develops increasingly sophisticated ways of analyzing the biological and geological and chemical evidence that the site contains. But the question itself, the question of whether the temple came before the farm, of whether the spiritual impulse preceded and generated the agricultural revolution, is a question of staggering importance. It is a question about human nature in the deepest sense. About what drove our species to do the extraordinary, counterintuitive, civilization-making thing of deciding to stay in one place and grow food rather than following the food as it moved. About what need was urgent enough to override the nomadic logic that had served human beings for 100,000 years and create the settled life that built everything that followed. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe suggests that the need was not primarily practical. Not primarily driven by hunger or by resource depletion or by population pressure or by any of the other practical triggers that the standard models of agricultural origins had proposed. The need was spiritual. The need to come together in a sacred place, to build something that spoke of meaning and order and the relationship between the human world and the forces beyond it, to create a monument that said we were here and this mattered and we understood something about the world that we needed to express in stone. This need, the most human of all needs, may have been the engine of the agricultural revolution and through it the engine of civilization itself. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, at the age of 60, of a heart attack while on holiday. He had spent 20 years excavating less than 5% of his discovery. He knew, and said publicly, that the full extent of what lay beneath Potbelly Hill would keep archaeologists busy for generations after him. The excavation continues under the direction of his colleagues and successors, with new technologies and new questions producing new revelations every year. In 2018, excavations revealed that the hilltop had been deliberately buried, that the ancient builders had intentionally filled in the enclosures they had completed and built new ones on top of them, layer by layer, in a process that both preserved the lower levels with extraordinary completeness and raises new questions about why the act of deliberate burial was itself a meaningful ritual act. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar surveys of the unexcavated portions of the site revealed the outlines of dozens of additional enclosures and structures waiting beneath the surface. The full extent of Göbekli Tepe is far larger than even the 20 years of excavation had suggested. The site that the 1963 survey had dismissed as a medieval cemetery turns out to be one of the largest and most complex prehistoric religious sites on the surface of the earth. Everything we thought we knew was wrong. The temple came first. The spiritual impulse drove the plow. The ceremony preceded the civilization and may have created it. And on a low, rounded hill in southeastern Turkey that a Kurdish shepherd noticed because some flat-topped stones were sticking out of the soil, the entire story of how human beings became human is still being excavated, layer by layer, stone by stone, from the ground that has been keeping it safe for 12,000 years. The stones are still talking. We are still learning to listen.